Okay, we've talked in a couple of chapters now about the ways that we create identities around ourselves, and not just us individually, but collectively as a community, um, as a society. And one of the most important identifiers that comes to most people's mind is your family, your descent, how you calculate who you are based on where you come from, what your relationships are to other people in terms of biology, but also there's social aspects of that as well. Now, there we tend to think, and in fact, politicians quite often play up what normal is, and to sort of say, oh, a politician wants to say, we're going to restore this particular normal aspect of society. But the frank matter is that there is no one way to construct a family unit. There's no one way to calculate your identity amongst other relationships. There are many different ways this can be done. Now, as we've seen from other chapters, the way you live your life, the way you organize your society, the way you get what food and water you have, has a knock-on effect of how you identify. So there's going to be some patterns that emerge in how you identify your family unit and what kind of group organization you have. But there are a lot of different varieties. Not an infinite number of varieties, however, because there is some basic biology involved. We reproduce by having a male and a female mate together and produce offspring. So there is something physiological and physical about having offspring. But what about things like adopted parents? Well, this is, are they is a non-biological parent still a parent? Well, yes, they certainly can be. And in fact, what anthropology tries to do is break down the way that we can describe emically, so the insider's view, and then take some terminology and apply those to those emic experiences that are etic universal terminology. So these will sound a little bit jargonistic, and you're going to have to learn some terms for this chapter, but they'll be very helpful in describing the relationships from a scientist's point of view, not just that this is the word that I use for this relationship that I have from an emic perspective, but from an etic perspective, we can then compare different ways that people organize their ideas about their family and descent identities. So one thing that we need to first come to grips with is that families are part of what we call kinship. So your relationships. And these are organized into the ways that we structure an idea of family. But your identity comes from who came before you, in one sense as well. You also get a little bit of identity who you give birth to. Your children, your offspring, also can affect your identity. But we tend to talk about what we call descent groups. And these are based on a belief in a shared ancestry with other people. Now, I say belief in a shared ancestry because it doesn't necessarily have to be true. For you to, if you all believe that you're part of the same ancestral group, that's a powerful identifier, even if the scientific truth behind it is not there. And as I said, there's not just one way of coming up with a descent group. We tend to think in this country of the typical family group is a nuclear family, meaning consisting of parents and children. And they normally live in the same household together. But even there, even with something as simple as that starts to break down almost immediately, because you were a child once and you lived in you lived in a family of some sort, of some organization, and a nuclear family may be familiar to you, it may be unfamiliar to you, it may be your experience, it may not. But when you reached a certain age in this country, you're expected to leave that family, typically, and start another family. So who is included in that group? And so we, in anthropology, we tend to take this transition from being a child growing up in a family. We call that the family of orientation, and that's easy to remember. That you're getting oriented in the world. You're born into this family, you grow up in this family, and you are oriented in that family. You are acculturated and into society through that family group as your lens. But when you grow up and you leave and you get married, find a marriage partner, and you start a family of your own, this is what's called, anthropologists call, the family of procreation. So you grew up in a family of orientation, but from your parents' point of view, that was the family of orientation. Now that family can be nuclear. It can be mother, father, children all living in the same household. But what about the grandparents? They were once the nuclear, possibly nuclear family of that family of procreation for them, family of orientation for your parents. So this all starts to break down, even simply within our own lifetimes. We make decisions about who lives under the same household, who we call part of our own families. So claims are made, like I said earlier, for that nuclear families as the typical normal way of doing things, but this doesn't really hold up to any scrutiny at all. So nuclear families are widespread around the world, but it's not a universal. There are many different ways of doing things. And the significance of a nuclear family it differs from society to society. So the weight that one places on the family values of having a mother, a father, and children living in one household are different from in different communities. For instance, in America, we tend to think of the family of procreation with the mother, father, children living under one roof, but not the grandparents and not the grandchildren often in the same household. That would be atypical. It tends to be thought of as atypical. But in some places, like your book mentions, the Zadrugas in Bosnia have large extended families, and it's not just one. It's not just a grandparents or great grandparents. It's all of their children, so cousins and aunts and uncles, all living under, headed by a male householder and head and his wife. And so that would be considered typical, but that would be unusual in this country. There's some other examples as well of extended families for instance, the Nayars in India are also mentioned in your book, and you can read a little bit more about that. But in America, industrialization and living in big cities has led to a reorganization of family units. We tend to, in America, have a tendency to move away from the house because of job mobility. In a place where you have a farming community and you're constantly living on that farm and you stay there generation after generation, it's easier to have an extended family in that sort of circumstance. But what if you grow up in a household where someone has a job that you don't want to share, that you don't want to take on? So you might go get educated and find a job in another city. That doesn't really lend itself to large extended families. And this is what we call neo-locality, that a living situation in which a couple, a person leaves their house, they find a marriage partner, and they establish a new residence in a new location, neo-locality. So many large industrialized societies, this is a pretty typical residence pattern where and it can change from class to class in particular social and historical conditions. And this has actually led to, we'll talk a little bit more about this when we come to the chapter on marriage, but for instance, when women become more involved in the workforce, they have greater access to cash and to making their own choices and decisions about things. That can lead to things like rise in divorce rates, and which often is thought of as a very bad thing, but actually that's representative that women feel that they are free to leave bad situations sometimes. And so when you find divorce rates, it often coincides with economic and social freedom of women. But that also then leads to single parent homes sometimes, and in fact, the rate of growth of single parent homes has outgrown even the population increase. And the trend in North America, Western Europe, is towards smaller family sizes, and a smaller range of people that you would call your kin. But of course, this is all based on sort of things that we're familiar with, certain types of societies that we find more familiar. But when you move out of industrialized environments, social environments, we have to think of we have to have some different terminology for the ways that people organize their family and kin calculations based on different organizational structures. So let's get into some of the terminology that we're talking about here. So when dissent is an important word that will keep coming up, and dissent groups are ways that you organize your ideas around where you come from ancestrally. So let's take myself for example. My last name is McCarthy. Now, we don't tend to think very carefully about names in this country. I just inherited the name from my father. But already, there's something there. Why did I get it from my father and not my mother? Well, we have a certain way of organizing that typically in our country, we tend to be patrilinear. You think of linear as a line, that if you're tracing your ancestry and your descent, if it's traced through your father's line, it's called patrilinearity. If I were to have taken my mother's name, that would have been a case of matrilinearity. Now, that would have been against the norm in this country, but there are some cultures that is typical, that you get your identity from your mother's line, and that's matrilinearity. And you often have, when you have neolocations for certain people, it tends to follow some of this kinship calculation in terms of descent. So what I mean by that is that if you are patrilinear, so I get my name from my father, then if I were to seek a marriage partner and I would stay in my father's location, I would get the benefits of being associated with that lineage, with that descent group, that identity. That would get me jobs, that would get me social cachet, and I would bring in a wife from someplace else. I would seek another village or another person from outside of my group to bring in, and that would be patrilocality. And you often find these two things together. So patrilinearity, how you calculate your identity, is the linearity, and where you stay or move into is locality. So patrilinearity, patrilocality would be in the case of me taking my father's name and bringing a wife into my community. On the other side of that, you would have matrilinearity and matrilocality, that if my wife was getting her descent identification from her mother's side of the family and got all of that power and privilege that came from being part of that family, and I went into her community, I would be entering into a matrilocal group. So that would be matrilinear, matrilocality. And often these groups tend to think of way in the distant past there was an apical, A-P-I-C-A-L, apical ancestor, like the apex of this whole family group, and right at the top of that pyramid of ancestry, there was one person or one originator of this group. And it can be demonstrated. You can show today. You can even test DNA to see if you are part of a group, or it can be a demonstrated descent, or it can be stipulated descent. And clans, what we call clans, are often stipulated descent. That there's no proof that you are descended from this ancestor. So let's take my example again. My last name is McCarthy. There are a lot of McCarthys out there. I'm not the only one. There are millions and millions and millions. But every single McCarthy out there, Mick in Irish refers to being the son of, and Carthy is that apical ancestor in the past that every McCarthy claims to have been descended from. So there was some Carthy in the past, and Mick Carthy was the son of Carthy, and all McCarthys are the sons of the sons of the sons of the sons of some Carthy back in the past. It doesn't have to be a real ancestor, though. I don't know if there was a Carthy. I know that the name McCarthy goes back a very, very long way, but it is an ancestral apical ancestor that gives meaning to this name and gives a sort of sense of identity of all McCarthys. All McCarthys share this ancestry, at least this idea of an ancestry. And when I say that it doesn't have to be real, there are some cultures that actually claim to be descended from things like animals or spirits or plants, and these are what we call totems. So there's a totemic ancestry. In fact, a totem pole is really a visual 3D representation of the ancestry of that particular tribe or clan. So why do we do it this way? Well, as I've mentioned before, the economics and the political structures sort of frame everything, and the way you live your life will have an effect on some of the ways that you organize, even things like how you calculate your identity in a family group. And so with especially living in sedentary communities, residence rules for matrilinearity or matrilocality or patrilocality ensures that about half of the people born in a generation will live out their lives on that ancestral land or estate or location. And then that creates a perpetuation of property and ensures that the success of that group will carry on intergenerationally. You can also calculate your descent not from one line, but from either or both lines. This is what we call ambilineal descent. So matrilinearity and patrilinearity are what we call unilinear descent calculations. But with ambilinearity or non-unilinear descent calculation, you can choose which descent group you join. So with this, we've talked about these terms before, that you have got ascribed characteristics, you've got ascribed identities, and you've got achieved identities. So a unilinear descent is an ascribed identity. I had no choice whether I was called McCarthy or not. That was done to me. That was ascribed to me, and it was typical. It was a typical pattern for this country. So taking my father's name was nothing unusual. But membership in an ambilineal descent group is more fluid, and you can change your descent group and its membership or belong to two or more descent groups at the same time. And this is usually achieved identity, achieved membership. And descent groups aren't necessarily family groups either. So what do I share in common with some other person in Ireland who has the name McCarthy? Very, very little. They are a descent group, but I don't really identify with that person. They're not part of my family. They're not part of my close-knit group of people that I interact with very regularly. And so these two groups could be at conflict with one another. So if some person knocked on my door and said, I'm a McCarthy, give me a loan of some money, I would say, take a hike. I don't know you. I don't care that you share my name. Yes, I have a little bit in common with you because we share some mythical Carthy ancestor, but you're not part of my family. And if a person from my family were to, the way I calculate my family, were to come to my door and ask me for a loan, I might give it to them. So these are where these aren't necessarily, they can be the same, but they don't have to be the same. So descent groups and family groups are not always in line with one another. And they can also, the way you calculate your inclusion and membership in certain types of descent groups or family groups can alter your behavior as well. So for descent groups, compared with patrilineal systems, matrilineal societies tend to have higher divorce rates because women have more freedom to be able to leave bad relationships, and greater female promiscuity in those sort of societies as well, because women don't feel as controlled in their own sexuality in matrilineal societies. But also, as we'll see in a moment, family calculation and kinship calculation can also change your behavior, and this will come into play especially when we come to the chapter on marriage next up. The reason why marriage the chapter on marriage will be important is because who do you marry? Can you marry a sister? Can you marry a brother? Can you marry a parent or a child? Well, maybe not. But how do you calculate who is your relative? Can you marry a cousin? Maybe. But even if you can't, what constitutes a cousin? What do we call a cousin? How we call people things, how we define them and organize them, because these aren't universals, these are differing patterns, can actually then dictate who you can choose as a marriage